Chapter 9 of Jimbo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jimbo by Algernon Blackwood. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 9. The Means of Escape. A week passed, and Jimbo began to wonder if the pains he so much dreaded, yet so eagerly longed for, were ever coming at all. The imprisonment was telling upon him, and he grew very thin, and consequently very light. The nights, though he spent them alone, were easily borne, for he was then intensely occupied, and the time passed swiftly. The moment it was dark he stepped into the gallery of memories, and in a little while passed into a new world of wonder and delight. But the daytime seemed always long. He stood for hours by the window, watching the trees and the sky, and what he saw always set painful currents running through his blood, unsatisfied longings, yearnings, and immense desires he could never understand. The white clouds on their swift journeys took with them something from his heart every time he looked upon them. They melted into air and blue sky, and lo, that something came back to him, charged with all the wild freedom and magic of open spaces, distance, and rushing winds. But the change was close at hand. One night, as he was standing by the open window, listening to the drip of the rain, he felt a deadly weakness steal over him. The strength went out of his legs. First he turned hot, and then he turned cold. Clammy perspiration broke out all over him, and it was all he could do to crawl across the room and throw himself onto the bed. But no sooner was he stretched out on the mattress than the feelings passed entirely, and behind left them an intoxicating sense of strength and lightness. His muscles became like steel springs. His bones were strong as iron and light as cork. A wonderful vigour had suddenly come into him, and he felt as if he had just stepped from a dungeon into fresh air. He was ready to face anything in the world. But before he had time to realize the full enjoyment of these new sensations, a stinging, blinding pain shot suddenly through his right shoulder, as if a red-hot iron had pierced to the very bone. He screamed out in agony, though even while he screamed the pain passed. Then the same thing happened to his other shoulder. It shot through his back with equal swiftness, and was gone, leaving him lying on the bed, trembling with pain. But the instant it was gone, delightful sensations of strength and lightness returned, and he felt as if his whole body were charged with some new and potent force. The pains had come at last. Jimbo had no notion how they could possibly be connected with escape, but Miss Lake, his kind and faithful friend Miss Lake, had said that no escape was possible without them, and had promised that they should be brief, and this was true, for the entire episode had not taken a minute of time. Escape! Escape! The words rushed through him like a flame of fire. Out of this dreadful empty house, into the open spaces, beyond the prison wall, out where the wind and the rain could touch him, where he could feel the grass beneath his feet, and could see the whole sky at once, instead of this narrow strip through the window. His thoughts flew to the stars and the clouds. But a strange humming of voices interrupted his flight of imagination, and he saw that the room was suddenly full of moving figures. They were passing before him with silent footsteps across the window from door to door. How they had come in, or how they went out, he never knew, but his heart stood still for an instant as he recognized the mournful figures of the frightened children filing before him in a slow procession. They were singing, though it sounded more like a chorus of whispering than actual singing, and as they moved past with the measured steps of their sorrowful dance, he caught the words of the song he had heard them sing when he first came into the house. We hear the little voices in the wind, singing of freedom we may never find. Jimbo put his fingers into his ears, but still the sound came through. He heard the words almost as if they were inside himself, his own thoughts, singing, "We hear the little footsteps in the rain, running to help us, though they run in vain, tapping in hundreds on the window pane." The horrible procession filed past and melted away near the door. They were gone as mysteriously as they had come, and almost before he realized it. He sprang from the bed and tried the doors. Both were locked. How in the world had the children got in and out? The whispering voices rose again on the night air, and this time he was sure they came from outside. He ran to the open window and thrust his head out cautiously. Sure enough, the procession was moving slowly, still with the steps of that impish dance, across the courtyard stones. He could just make out the slow waving arms, the thin bodies, and the white little faces as they passed on silent feet through the darkness, and again a fragment of the song rose to his ears as he watched, and filled him with an overpowering sadness. "We have no joy in any children's game, for happiness to us is but a name, since Terror kissed us with his lips of flame." Then he noticed that the group was growing smaller. Already the numbers were less. Somewhere, over there in the dark corner of the yard, the children disappeared, though it was too dark to see precisely how or where. "We dance with phantoms and with shadows play," rose to his ears. Then suddenly he remembered the little white upright stones he had seen in that corner of the yard, and understood. One by one they vanished just behind those stones. Jimbo shivered and drew his head in. He did not like those upright stones. They made him uncomfortable and afraid. Now, however, the last child had disappeared and the song had ceased. He realized what his fate would be if the escape were not successful. He would become one of this band of frightened children, dwelling somewhere behind the upright stones, a terrified shadow, waiting in vain to be rescued, waiting perhaps for ever and ever. The thought brought the tears to his eyes, but he somehow managed to choke them down. He knew it was the young portion of him only that felt afraid, the body. The older self could not feel fear, and had nothing to do with tears. He lay down again on the hard mattress and waited, and soon afterwards the first crimson streaks of sunrise appeared behind the high elms, and rooks began to caw and shake their wings in the upper branches. A little later the governess came in. Before he could move out of the way, for he disliked being embraced, she had her arms round his neck and was covering him with kisses. He saw tears in her eyes. "You darling Jimbo," she cried. "They've come at last." "How do you know?" he asked, surprised at her knowledge, and puzzled by her display of emotion. "I heard you scream to begin with. Besides, I've been watching." "Watching?" "Yes, and listening too. Every night, every single night. You've hardly been a minute out of my sight," she added. "I think it's awfully good of you," he said doubtfully, "but—" A flood of questions followed, about the upright stones, the shadowy children, where she spent the night watching him, and 100 other things besides. But he got little satisfaction out of her. He never did when it was Jimbo, the child, that asked, and he remained Jimbo, the child, all that day. She only told him that all was going well. The pains had come, he had grown nice and thin and light. The children had come into his room as a hint that he belonged to their band, and other things had happened about which she would tell him later. The crisis was close at hand. That was all he could get out of her. "It won't be long now," she said excitedly. "They'll come tonight, I expect." "What will come tonight?" he asked with